Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second lecture in the Plymouth Historical Anniversary Series. Um, Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to make sure to remind you our next lecture is Tuesday of this week, the 28th, with Tom Vaughn, because he works at Old Sturbridge Village, and so now he can come on a Tuesday. He can't come on Friday because he's working. So our next lecture will be on Tuesday here, same time. It's my honor tonight to introduce Commander Keith Galnick from American Legion Post 20. The American Legion is made up not only of individuals who fight to save our freedom, but the American Legion also does a tremendous amount of good right here in the Plymouth community by raising funds for various organizations. And so it's my honor to introduce our speaker for this evening on Plymouth's military history, and that's Commander Keith Galnick.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and I hope the Congregationalists don't mind a Lutheran up here at the pulpit. Some say Lutherans are just lazy Catholics, so I don't know if that's good or bad. Well, that's good. There's a few of us in here, so we got some of the Martin Luther Mafia sitting over here in this area. I decided that since the Catholics have the Knights of Columbus, that the Lutherans needed something. So I pitched the idea of forming the Martin Luther Mafia, and they took that name and they ran with it. So tonight I will cover some of the military history of the town of Plymouth, and it also goes back to when we were Northbury. And this is not a complete history of all military service, wars, and campaigns, but rather some facts and history on individuals that I thought some might find interesting. Some of the words and terms used here, although may not be politically correct and may be termed offensive to some, have been included, as they are part of the original text of Francis Atwater's History of Plymouth, published in 1895. Rather than trying to remember items and things, and my memory is not as good as maybe Dick Foot's or Matt Malley's, I took the liberty of going to read most of this directly out of the Francis Atwater's history book for the Revolutionary War and the Civil War periods, and I found some good articles on some other things that I thought people would find interesting. And if you'll forgive me, I was recently diagnosed with the diabetes. That medication makes my throat dry out quick, so. I'll start with that part of the inhabitants of Northbury Parish took in the Revolutionary War at this date could only be told in a fragmentary way. The town records of Waterbury and Watertown, of which this parish was a part during the stormy days when the struggle for independence was going on, afford but little information, while the official papers of the state leave the subject a matter of more or less uncertainty and conjecture. It is known that the parish was a stronghold of Toryism, a majority of leading men west of the river, that would be the Naugatuck, holding fast to the British allegiance. Bitter enmities were engendered and violent acts were committed. This disgraceful doings of the North Military Company, or train band, led to its dissolution by the General Assembly, its members being added to the Farmingbury and Westbury companies and to Captain Nathaniel Barnes' company in the same parish. These Tories, however, should be judged leniently, for they were connected by ties of religious association and support with the mother country, and their pastors, sincere men, taught them that the colonial cause was treason against government and God. While all the action against the Tories was not justifiable, it was not to be wondered at as human nature is constituted. A Tory was hung up almost dead on the green, and a hook was shown in an old tavern which stood near the Andrew Buell place, where others were so hung. Devil's Lane was near the tavern, and County Sheriff Lord of Litchfield afterwards made arrests there, so that they said, the Lord came down from Litchfield and took the devil out of Plymouth, though he soon returned. The only Tory known to have been executed in Connecticut was Moses Dunbar, who was taken from Plymouth, tried in Hartford for high treason, and hung from a tree near where Trinity College now stands on March 19, 1777. Dunbar was a young man, barely over 30 years of age, honest in his convictions, and was probably a victim of a law that unnecessarily deprived him of his life, as the death penalty against treason was soon afterwards repealed. He offered to confine himself to his farm, if allowed his liberty, and hold no intercourse whatever with his neighbors. His family was highly incensed against him because of his joining the Episcopal Church and later espousing Toryism. So indignant was his father that he offered to furnish the hemp for a halter to hang him with. Moses Dunbar, he was part of the Dunbars that were mostly left and formed East Church, right where Louise lives, and they were part of that group of Tories that had that area. I believe his sister or his brother-in-law, they're buried over at St. Matthew's Cemetery in East Plymouth. The only records indicative of the revolution was a vote, December 7th, 1778, in consideration of provision running to an extravagant price, to furnish Mr. Stores certain articles at specified prices. In 1774, when Congress resolved on a non-intercourse with Great Britain, Phineas Royce was moderator of a special town meeting in Waterbury, a mark of his prominence. At that meeting, Nathaniel Barnes, Dr. Roger Conant, and Jotham Curtis of Northbury were on the committee to see that no tea, molasses, sugar, coffee, spices, etc. were brought into town and sold. At another meeting held on January 12th, Stephen Seymour, Randall Evans, and David Smith of Northbury were on a committee to receive donations contributed for the relief of the poor in Boston, whose port was then closed by the British fleet. Northbury sent Deacon Camp, father of Deacon Camp, lately of Plainville, through the wilderness of Maine with Arnold Benedict to besiege Quebec in the winter of 1775. Daniel Rowe, grandfather of A. Markham on his mother's side, was at the Battle of Saratoga and was the first to reach Benedict Arnold after he was wounded and rendered efficient aid. This was before Benedict Arnold became a traitor when he was caught near West Point. At that point, he was on our side. David Smith, who lived where the Quiet House now stands, and Matt, I believe it's, where'd you go, Matt? It's right over here to my right, your left. Attained the rank of major and subsequently became a general of the Connecticut militia. He was in General Worcester's regiment, which took part in the operations along Lake George and Champlain. He was at the Battle of Germantown, October 4th, 1777, and wintered at Valley Forge in 1777 to 78, and was there appointed Brigadier Major to General Varnum's brigade by special orders on March 29, 1778. He was a prominent man at the time of the incorporation of Plymouth, having been sent to the legislature as a representative from Watertown for several terms. He was a merchant, and his store was located in the rear of the present town building. Now remember, this was written in 1895, and the present town building is also located right to your left, a little behind you, and it's that brick building that Helen Edgefeld now owns. He was a member of the Society of the Cincinnati. Captains Jotham Curtis and Nathaniel Barnes received 6 pounds and 16 pounds respectively as bounties at Fishkill in October 1777 by Lieutenant Colonel J. Baldwin for taking their companies to the aid of the Continental Army on the North River. They also turned out to repel Tryon's invasion at New Haven, July 5, 1779. Captain Curtis' company was composed as follows: Lieutenant Timothy Pond, Ensign Samuel Scoville, Privates Andrew Stores, Phineas Royce, Stephen Curtis, Randall Evans, Samuel Curtis, Benjamin Upson, Samuel Penfield, Charles Cook, Ebenezer Cook, John Dunbar, Aaron Dunbar, Joel Stanford. Jason Fenn, Ithiel Fancher, Joel Fancher, David Foote, David Humiston, John Sutliff, Samuel Griggs, Zachariah Hitchcock, James Curtis, Eliakim Potter, Bartholomew Pond, Ezekiel Tuttle, a fellow by the name of Parker, and William Southmaid. Some of those names are families that are still here in town that date back to those days. In the successful campaign in the French War, also known as the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, when Crown Point and Ticonderoga were taken, Waterbury furnished a company in which John Sutliff was lieutenant. In that war, Daniel Potter was ensign, and Asher Blakesley, Enos Ford, and others were engaged. Now what's interesting is the oldest survivor of the Revolution and the last pensioner of that war was born right here in Northbury Parish in 1764. His name was Lemuel Cook, and he was the son of Henry Cook, the first settler of the town. He enlisted at Cheshire when only 16 years old. He was mustered in at Northampton in the Bay States 2nd Regiment, Light Dragoons. Sheldon, Colonel, Stanton, Sheldon was the colonel and Stanton was captain. He married Hannah Curtis at Cheshire, by whom he had 11 children. He married a second time at the age of 70. No record if he had any more children then. About 30 years previous to his death, he removed to the town of Clarendon near Rochester, Orleans County, New York. He died there on May 20th, 1866, aged 102 years. The late Reverend E.B. Hillard, which I believe Matt talked about last week. Did you talk about Reverend Hillard?
Yeah, Reverend Hillard.
Yep. Visited Mr. Cook in July 1864, 2 years prior to his death, and he later related the circumstances of his enlistment and early service as follows. When I applied to enlist, Captain Halibut told me I was so small he couldn't take me unless I would enlist for the war. The first time I smelt gunpowder was at Valentin's Hill, Westchester, New York. A troop of British horse were coming. "Mount your horses in a minute," cried the colonel. I was on mine as quick as a squirrel. There were 2 fires. Crash! Up came Darrell, good old soul, and said, "Lem, what do you think of gunpowder? Smell good to you?" The first time I was ordered on sentry was at Dobbs Ferry. A man came out of a bar and leveled his piece and fired. I felt the wind of the ball. The soldier near me said, "Lem, they mean you. Go on the other side of the road." So I went over, and pretty soon another man came out of the bar and aimed and fired. He didn't come near me. Soon after, another came out and fired. His ball lodged in my hat. By this time the firing had roused the camp, and a company of our troops came on one side, and a party of the French on the other. And they took the men in the barn prisoners and brought them in. They were cowboys. This was the first time I saw the French in operation. They stepped as though on edge. They were a dreadful, proud nation. When they brought the men in, one of them had the impudence to ask, "Is the man here we fired at just now?" "Yes," said Major Talmadge. "There he is, that boy." Then he told me how they had each laid out a crown and agreed that the one who brought me down should have the 3. When I got through with his story, I stepped to my holster and took out my pistol and walked up to him and said, "If I've been a mark to you for money, I'll take my turn now. So, deliver your money or your life." He handed over 4 crowns, and I got 3 more from the other 2. Mr. Cook was at the Battle of Brandywine and at Cornwallis's surrender. Of the latter, he gives the following account. It was reported Washington was going to storm New York. We made a bylaw in a regiment that every man should stick to his horse. If his horse went, he should go with him. I was a waiter for the quartermaster, and so had a chance to keep my horse in good condition. Baron Steuben was muster master. He had called us out to select men and horses fit for service. Baron von Steuben was instrumental in the Revolutionary War as he came over from Germany, and he helped to form the American Army with drill and ceremony, taught him how to march, how to do rifle drills and everything. So it's pretty interesting that a little fellow here from Plymouth, Northbury at the time, was in the presence of such a great man. He had called us out to select men and horses fit for service. When he came to me, he said, "Young man, how old are you?" I told him. "Be on the ground tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, said he. My colonel didn't like to have me go. "You'll see," said he. "They'll call for him tomorrow morning." But they said if we had a law, we must abide by it. Next morning, old Steuben had got my name. There were 18 out of the regiment. "Be on the ground," said he. "Tomorrow morning with 2 days' provisions." "You're a fool," said the rest. "They're going to storm New York. No more idea of it than going to Flanders." My horse was a bay and pretty. Next morning I was second on parade. We marched off towards White Plains, then left the wheel and struck right north. Got to King's Ferry below Tarrytown. There were boats, scows, etc. We went right across into the Jerseys. That night I stood with my back to a tree. Then we held on to the head of then we went on to the head of the Elk. There the French were. It was dusty. Appeared to me I should have choked to death. One of them handed me his canteen. "Lem," said he, "take a good horn. We're going to march all night." I didn't know what it was, so I took a full drink. It liked to have strangled me. Must have been some good rum or whiskey, I'd say. Then we were in Virginia. There wasn't much fighting. Cornwallis tried to force his way north to New York, but fell into the arms of Lafayette, and he drove them back. Old Rochambeau told him, "I'll land 500 from the fleet against your 800, but they darnst. We were on a kind of a side hill. We had plaguely little to eat and nothing to drink under heaven. We hove up some brush to keep the flies off. Washington ordered that there should be no laughing at the British. Said it was bad enough to have to surrender without being insulted. The army came out with guns clubbed on their backs. They were paraded on a great smooth lot, and there they stacked their arms. Then came the devil, old women and all, camp followers. One said, 'I wonder if the damned Yankees will give me any bread.' The horses were starved out. Washington turned out with his horses and helped them up the hill. When they see the artillery, they said, 'There, them's the very artillery that belonged to Burgoyne.' Greene came up from the southward, the awfulest set you ever see. Some, I should presume, had a pint of lice on 'em, no boots or shoes." Mr. Cook's condition Mr. Hilliard described as follows. The old man's talk is very broken and fragmentary. He recalls the past slowly and with difficulty, but when he has fixed his mind upon it, all seems to come up clear. His articulation also is very imperfect, so that it is with difficulty that his story could be made out. Much of his experience in the war seems gone from him, and in conversation with him he has to be left to the course of his own thoughts, inquiries and suggestions, appearing to confuse him. At the close of the war, he married Hannah Curtis of Cheshire, Connecticut, and lived a while in that vicinity, after which he removed to Utica, New York. There he had frequent encounters with the Indians who still infested the region, one of whom he had some difficulty about cattle, and at one time assailed him at a public house as he was on his way home, coming at him with great fury with a drawn knife. Mr. Cook was unarmed, but catching up a chair, he presented it as a shield against the Indians' thrusts till help appeared. He says he never knew what fear was, and always declared that no man should take him prisoner alive. His frame is large, his presence commanding, and in his prime he must have possessed prodigious strength. He has evidently been a man of most resolute spirit, the old determination still manifesting itself in his look and words. His voice, the full power of which he still retains, is marvelous for his volume and strength. Speaking of the present war, i.e. the Civil War, he said in his strong tones, at the same time bringing down his cane with force upon the floor, "It is terrible, but terrible as it is, the rebellion must be put down." He still walks comfortably with the help of a cane, and with the aid of glasses reads his book, as he calls the Bible. He is fond of company, loves a joke, and is good-natured in a rough sort of way. He likes to relate his experiences in the Army and among the Indians. He has voted the Democratic ticket since the organization of the government, supposing that it still represents the same party that it did in Jefferson's time. His pension before its increase was $100. It is now $200. The old man's health is comfortably good, and he enjoys life as much as could be expected at his great age. His home at present is with a son, whose wife especially seems to take kind and tender care of him. Altogether, he is a noble old man, and long may yet it be before his name shall be missed from the roll of his country's deliverers. Atwater wrote, "There were no more loyal or brave soldiers than the sons of Plymouth, several who gained honorable distinction while others met untimely deaths, at the front and in the very heat of battle belonging to the town." In the Civil War, Plymouth may be well proud of her record. Her sons were scattered in nearly every Connecticut regiment, and some also in regiments from other states. Company D, 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, had 53 local men. Company I, 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery, was principally made up of Plymouth men, and many more were in the 1st Cavalry Connecticut Volunteers. From the beginning of the war until Lee surrendered, these brave, loyal soldiers were found in all of the principal conflicts. In several instances, their gallant services were so far recognized as to receive deserved promotion. The 3 principal commanding officers of the 1st Connecticut Cavalry were identified with this town: Brigadier General Orestes Blakesley, Major L.P. Goodwin, who for a considerable time commanded as ranking officer, and Brigadier General Brayton Ives, who belongs to one of the oldest families. Another plucky fighter was Colonel Augustus H. Fenn, now judge of the Connecticut Supreme Court, who lost his right arm at the Battle of Cedar Creek, and in only 7 weeks reported for duty. Major William B. Ells commanded the 3rd Battalion at Cold Harbor and was made a cripple for several years by a shot wound to the leg. Lieutenants Franklin J. Candy and Horace Hubbard were killed at the Oppequon Creek battle. They belonged to the 2nd Artillery, which was in the hottest of the fight. Edward P. Smith of Company I, 1st Artillery, was the first Plymouth soldier who died in service, and his funeral largely attended by people from far and near, his remains having been sent to Terryville embalmed. When President Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 more men after the disastrous Peninsula Campaign, Litchfield County voted to raise an entire regiment. L.W. Wessels was made colonel, and the regiment went into camp at Litchfield on August 21, 1862. Plymouth united once again with Watertown to raise a company, the recruiting officers being A.H. Fenn, W.H. Lewis, Jr., and Captain Eugene Atwater. Plymouth furnished 53 men, Watertown 18, and Harwington 13. William B. Ells, then 2nd Lieutenant of the 1st Connecticut Artillery, stationed at Fort Richardson, was chosen captain. W.H. Lewis, Jr., 1st Lieutenant, and Robert A. Potter, 2nd Lieutenant. The regiment was the 19th Connecticut Volunteers. It was presented with a beautiful stand of colors by Mrs. William Curtis Noyes of Litchfield, and on the 11th of September was mustered into service of the United States for 3 years. The battalion consisted of 889 men and officers, left on the 15th for Washington. It moved on to Alexandria, where it remained until the middle of January following. It was while at this point that Arthur G. Kellogg of Charlie Company died on the Loath of November, 1862. He was the 3rd death that occurred in the regiment. The health of these soldiers continued to grow worse, and as there were reports of neglect and harsh treatment of the sick, Governor Buckingham sent Dr. S.T. Salisbury of Plymouth to investigate, who reported that everything was being done that was possible for the men. The regiment was removed to Washington to do defense duty, and in the fall was changed into an artillery regiment, recruiting its numbers to 1,800 men by the following March. Up to this period, The following Plymouth men had died. Burr H. Tolles, January 12, 1863, fever, buried in Terryville. Up on Allentown Road is where he's buried, right up along the street. Charles C. J. Cleveland, January 30th, 1863, fever, buried in Terryville. George H. Holt, February 26, 1863, died of diphtheria, buried in Terryville. Franklin W. Hubbard, April 10th, 1863, typhoid fever, buried in Terryville. Josiah J. Wadsworth, September 19th, 1863, spotted fever, buried in Hartford. Corporal Wesley F. Glover, December 28th, 1862, typhoid fever, buried in Woodville. George A. Hoyt Pfeiffer, June 6, 1863, fever, buried in Plymouth. Eben Norton, June 12, 1864, fever, buried in Plymouth. On the 20th of May in 1864, the regiment joined the Army of the Potomac near Spotsylvania Courthouse and were assigned to duty in the 2nd Brigade, 1st Division, 6th Corps. The 21st of May, the enemy was met and a series of marches were begun, which culminated at Cold Harbor on June 1st, 1864. In this engagement, the regiment had 114 killed, 197 wounded, 15 missing, and 3 died in prison. The rebels plied the position of musketry and swept it with grape and canister shots. Major Els was wounded almost by the first fire. Colonel Kellogg, proud of his men, was advanced to the foremost line, his towering and conspicuous form making him a target, and he too fell in the very beginning of the fight, pierced by a dozen bullets. I believe he is buried at Hillside Cemetery, up on the top where there's a Civil War monument where many of these fellows were laid to rest. The Plymouth Company was in the 3rd and Rear Battalion and suffered less severely than some of the other companies. The casualties resulting as follows. Killed, Philo A. Fenn, shot in the head by sharpshooters, June 12th, while on duty as a sharpshooter. John Murphy, shot in heart. George Comstock, real name George Brooks, Petersburg, June 22nd, died of wounds. George L. Beach, Cold Harbor, thigh, died at Washington, June 14, 1864. Was hit by bullet, which was afterwards taken out and put on his coffin at funeral. Thomas Mann, calf of leg, died at Washington, June 8th. Wounded was Quartermaster Sergeant David B. Worcester, thigh, slight, afterwards killed at Fisher's Hill. Justin Stoughton, shoulder and back. Chauncey Culver, side and breast, severe. Wallace E. Beach, arm. George T. Cook, shoulder. Zelatus F. Granus, head. Major William B. Ells, leg, severe. Corporal James R. Baldwin, of Company E from Winstead, who for some time previous to enlistment had resided in Plymouth and was the brother of the late N. Taylor Baldwin, was missing in this engagement and is believed to have died in a rebel prison. On the 20th of June, the regiment was in the trenches in front of Petersburg. Here, Matthias Walter of Plymouth was wounded by a sharpshooter, and John Gradier was fatally wounded by a piece from a 3-inch shell. On the 22nd of June, there was a skirmish with Hill's Rebel Division. Corporal James E. Guernsey was wounded in the shoulder and thigh and died on the 28th. It is supposed he was shot by the carelessness of one of his own comrades. George B. Hempstead of Company B, a former clerk in the store of B. H. Hemingway in Terryville, was shot in the right breast, the ball lodging in his watch. He also died on the 28th. The next engagement was the bloody Battle of Opequan. Here Hiram T. Coley was killed, as was First Lieutenant Franklin J. Candy, who while lying on the ground raised his head to look at his watch and was picked off by a sharpshooter. Second Lieutenant Horace Hubbard had his back fearfully torn by a shell and lived but a short time. The wounded were Corporal Henry N. Bushnell, neck, severe, Corporal David A. Bradley, neck, William Lindley, ringer, Henry Tolles, head, Corporal Ira H. Stoughton, hip, canister, Emery B. Taylor, thigh, Seeley Morris, thigh, George H. Bates side and back shell severe. The next battle was on the 22nd at Fisher's Hill. Quartermaster David B. Worcester was killed, and Charles L. Bryan and Swift McGee Hunter were slightly wounded. Then the memorable Battle of Cedar Creek, October 19th, came. The Plymouth men killed were Corporal Edward C. Hobson, Corporal William Wright, Abner W. Scott, and Charles R. Warner. Walter Oates was missing and doubtless died in a rebel prison. Captain Augustus H. Fenn lost his right arm at the shoulder. The regiment participated in no other battles, but belonged to the Army of the Potomac until mustered out August 18, 1865. Probably all of the older residents will recall the history of Dorrance Atwater, who kept records of Andersonville Prison. He is the son of Henry Atwater of Plymouth, and when a boy was a clerk in the store at Terryville. And if anybody's familiar with Bemis Street and the corner of High Street, there is a house there, I think it's blue in color, and that was where the Atwater boys grew up in that home. It still stands and retains most of its original clues of construction. Colonel A.H. Fenn, in writing of Mr. Atwater, says, has better claims to endure in remembrance than that of any other person from the town of Plymouth who went into war. The details of his life would read like a romance. At the age of 16, on the outbreak of war, he enlisted in the 1st Squadron of Connecticut Cavalry, upwards attached to the Harris Light Cavalry of New York. He served for nearly his full term, participating in hard campaigning and sharp battles that command experienced, and was finally captured and taken to the terrible Andersonville prison pen, where so many brave Connecticut boys met their death. He was an excellent pensman, and for this, or some other reason, he was detailed there for work in the surgeon's office of the hospital detachment, where it was part of his duty to keep a record of the dead, their regiments, number of their graves, etc. While doing this, he managed to keep an extra copy of the record for his own use, and this he brought away with him when he was paroled, concealing it under his clothing. Arriving at his home in Terryville, wasted almost to a skeleton by sickness, induced by army exposure, he was for a while dangerously ill. Meantime, the War Department heard of the valuable records and summoned him to Washington and purchased the right to copy the records, which were of invaluable service to the government and to friends of soldiers in determining the fate of many missing men. His carefully kept list contained the names of 13,000 dead soldiers. His rolls were copied according to agreement, and when Miss Clara Barton, the noble friend of Union soldiers, went on her expedition to Andersonville after the war to identify and properly mark the graves of the dead, Atwater was detailed for service with her. Can anybody tell me who Clara Barton is and what her fame is? Started the Red Cross. Very good. His records were placed in his possession and were the only reliable records obtainable for identification of the graves. The details of Mr. Atwater's subsequent experiences with the War Department show the most cruel case of injustice of a government towards one of its faithful servants, of which we have any knowledge. Now, the subject of this is written by Dorrance's brother, Francis. Francis was the one that published and wrote the book, so he is speaking, of course, of his own brother. He was made to suffer a cruel wrong, which to this day has never been rightened in the War Department. Now, of course, this was published in 1895. He was court-martialed for trying to conceal the list and served some time in prison, but he was later pardoned by President Andrew Johnson. In 1868, still suffering in health from his hardships, he was appointed United States Consul to the Seychelles Island in the Indian Ocean. 3 years later, he was transferred to the United States Consulate at Tahiti in the South Pacific. He was a faithful and valuable official in both positions, and only resigned after he had served over a score of years. He married a Tahitian princess, and by this marriage is allied to the royal family. His father was an English gentleman for many years in business in Tahiti. Or her father was, excuse me. Mr. Atwater still makes it his home in the South Pacific, coming to San Francisco once or twice a year. The following extracts from a report written by Miss Clara Barton, published in 1866, will be interesting in connection with the above. Having by official invitation been placed upon an expedition to Andersonville for the purpose of identifying and marking the graves of the dead contained in those noted prison grounds, it is perhaps not improper that I make some report of the circumstances which induced the sending of such an expedition, its work, and the appearance, condition, and surroundings of that interesting spot. Hallowed alike by the sufferings of the martyred, dead, and the tears and prayers for those who mourn them. During a search for the missing men of the United States Army, commenced in March 1865 under the sanction of our late lamented President Lincoln, I formed the acquaintance of Dorrance Atwater of Connecticut, a member of the 2nd New York Cavalry who had been a prisoner at Belle Isle and Andersonville for 22 months, and charged by the rebel authorities with the duty of keeping the death register of the Union prisoners who died amid the nameless cruelties of the last named prison. By minute inquiry, I learned from Mr. Atwater the method adopted in the burial of the dead, which he had made of the grounds. Pardon me. By minute inquiry, I learned from Mr. Atwater the method adopted in the burial of the dead, and by carefully comparing his account with a draft which he had made of the grounds appropriated for this purpose by the prison authorities, I became convinced of the possibility of identifying the graves, simply by comparing the numbered post or board marking each man's position in the trench in which he was buried, with his corresponding number standing against his name upon the register kept by Mr. Atwater, which he informed me was then in the possession of the War Department. Assured by the intelligence and frankness of my informant of the entire truthfulness of his statements, I decided to impart to the officers of the government the information I had gained, and accordingly brought the subject to the attention of General Hoffman, Commissary General of Prisoners, asking that a party or expedition be at once sent to Andersonville for the purpose of identifying and marking the graves and enclosing the grounds, and that Dorrance Atwater, with his register, accompany the same as the proper person to designate and identify. The subject appeared to have not only unheard but unthoughtful of, and from the generally prevailing impression that no care had been taken in the burial of our prisoners, the idea seemed at first difficult to be entertained. But the same facts which had served to convince me presented themselves favorably to the good understanding and kind heart of General Hoffman, who took immediate steps to lay the matter before the Honorable Secretary of War, upon whom, at his request, I called the following day, and learned from him that he had heard and approved my proposition, and decided to order an expedition consisting of materials and men under charge of some government officer for the accomplishment of the objects set forth in my request, and invited me to accompany the expedition in person, which invitation I accepted. A long-winded way to say that she got her way and got to go there. Accordingly, on the 8th of July, the Propeller Virginia, having on board fencing material, headboards, the prison records, 40 workmen, clerks, and letterers under command of Captain James M. Moore, Dorrance Atwater and myself left Washington for Andersonville via Savannah, Georgia, arriving at the latter place July 12th. Having waited at Savannah 7 days, and then resumed the journey by way of Augusta, Atlanta, and Macon, the entire party reached its destination in safety about noon on the 25th of July. We found the prison grounds, stockade, hospital sheds, and the various minor structures almost in the same condition in which they had been evacuated, and care is taken to leave these historic monuments undisturbed, so long as the elements spare them. There is not, and never was, any town or village at this place, except what grew out of its military occupation. Anderson Station on the road from Macon to Ifufla was selected as a depot for prisoners, probably on account of its remoteness and possible security, and the prison itself, with the buildings being sprung up around it, constituted all there was of Andersonville. The original enclosure of 19 acres was made in the unbroken woods, and the timber was only removed as it was wanted for the necessities of the prison. The enclosure was made in January 1864 and enlarged during the summer to 25 3/4 acres, being a quadrangle of 1,295 by 865 feet. The greatest length is from north to south, the ground rising from the middle towards each end in rather a steep, rounded hill, the northern one being at once the highest and of the greatest extent. A small stream, rising from springs a little to eastward, flows across it through a narrow valley filled with a compost washed down by the rains. The enclosing stockade is formed of pine logs, 20 feet in length and about 8 inches in diameter, sunk 5 feet in the ground, and placed close together. This is again surrounded by 2 successive and precisely similar palisades, a portion of the last of which is gone. It seems never to have been completed. The 2 inner walls remain entire. Within the interior space, at the distance of about 17 feet from the stockade, runs the famous dead line, marked by small posts set in the ground and a slight strip of pine board nailed on the tops of them. The gates of which there are 2, situated on the west side, were continuations of the stockade, enclosing spaces of 30 feet square, more or less, with massive doors at either end. They were arranged and worked on the principle of canal locks. Upon the inner stockade were 52 sentry boxes, raised upon the tops of the palisades, and accessible to the guard by ladders. In these stood 52 guards with loaded arms, so near that they can converse with each other. In addition to these, 7 forts mounted with field artillery commanded the fatal space, and its masses of Persian men. Under the most favorable circumstances and best possible management, the supply of water would have been insufficient for half the number of persons who had used it. The existing arrangements must have aggravated the evil to the utmost extent. The sole establishments for cooking and baking were placed on the bank of the stream immediately above, and between the 2 inner lines of palisades. The grease and refuse from them were found adhering to the banks at the time of our visit. The guards, to the number of almost 3,600, were principally encamped on the upper part of the stream, and when the heavy rains washed down the hillsides, covered with 80,000 human beings in the outlet below, failed to discharge the flood which backed and filled the valley. The water must have been so foul and loathsome that every statement I have seen of its offensiveness must be considered as falling short of the reality. And yet within rifle shot of the prison there flowed a stream 15 feet wide and 3 feet deep of pure, delicious water. Had the prison been placed so as to include a section of the Sweetwater Creek, the inmates may have drank and bathed to their heart's content. The cemetery around which the chief interest must gather is distant about 300 yards from the stockade in a northwesterly direction. The graves, placed side by side in close, continuous rows, cover 9 acres, divided into 3 unequal lots by 2 roads which intersect each other nearly at right angles. The 4th space is still unoccupied except by a few graves of 4 Confederate soldiers. No human bodies were found exposed, and none were removed. The place was found in much better condition than had been anticipated, owing to the excellent measures taken by Major General Wilson, commanding at Macon, and a humane, public-spirited citizen of Fort Valley, Georgia. A Mr. Griffin who, in passing on the railroad, was informed by one of the ever-faithful Negroes that the bodies were becoming exposed and were rooted up by animals. Having verified this statement, he collected a few Negroes, sank the exposed bodies, and covered them to a proper depth. He then reported the facts to General Wilson and requested authority to take steps for protecting the grounds. That patriotic officer visited Andersonville in person, appointed Mr. Griffin temporary superintendent, gave him such limited facilities as could be furnished in that destitute country. It was determined to enclose a square of 50 acres, and at the time of our arrival the fence was nearly 1/3 built from old lumber found about the place. He had also erected a brick kiln and was manufacturing brick for drains to conduct the water away from the graves and protect and strengthen the soil against the action of heavy rains. We found Mr. Griffin with a force of about 20 Negroes and a few mules at work on the grounds. I have understood that the gentleman furnished the labor at his own cost, while General Wilson issued the necessary rations. The part performed by our party was to take up and carry forward the work so well commenced. Additional force was obtained from the military commandant at Macon for completing the enclosure and erecting the headboards. It seems that the dead had been buried by Union prisoners paroled from the stockade and hospital for that purpose. Successive trenches capable of containing from 100 to 150 bodies each, thickly set with little posts or boards, with numbers in regular order carved upon them, told to the astonished and tear-dimmed eye the sad story of buried treasures. It was only necessary to compare the number upon each post or board with that which stands opposite the name on the register, and replace the whole with a more substantial, uniform, and comely tablet, bearing not only the original number, but the name, company, and regiment, and date of death of the soldier who slept beneath. I have been repeatedly assured by prisoners that great care was taken at the time by the men whom fell the sad task of originally marking this astonishing number of graves, to perform the work with faithfulness and accuracy. If it shall prove that the work performed by those who followed under circumstances so much more favorable was executed with less faithfulness and accuracy than the former, it will be a subject of much regret. But fortunately, not yet beyond the possibility of correction, the number of graves marked is 12,920. The original records captured by General Wilson furnished about 10,500. But as one book of the record had not yet been secured, over 2,000 names were supplied from a copy of his own record made by Mr. Atwater in the Andersonville prison, and brought by him to Annapolis on his return with the paroled prisoners. Interspersed throughout this death register were 400 numbers, against which stood only the dark word unknown. So scattered among the thickly designated graves stand 400 tablets, bearing only the number and the touching inscription, Unknown Union Soldier. Substantially nothing was attempted beyond enclosing the grounds, identifying and marking the graves, placing some appropriate models at the gates, and along the spaces designed for walks, and erecting a flagstaff in the center of the cemetery. The work was completed on the 17th of August, and the party took their route homeward by way of Chattanooga, Nashville, and Cincinnati, arriving at Washington on the morning of August 24th. For the record of your dead, you are indebted to the forethought, courage, and perseverance of Dorrance Atwater, a young man not yet 21 years of age, an orphan, 4 years a soldier, 1/10 part of his whole life a prisoner, with broken health and ruined hopes. He seeks to present to your acceptance the sad gift he has in store for you, and grateful for the opportunity. I hasten to place beside it this humble report, whose only merit is in its truthfulness, and beg you to accept it in the spirit of kindness in which it is offered. 1905, the town had erected a monument for Dorrance Atwater that sits at Baldwin Park. It's a cannon with cannonball, and it's aimed right here in this direction, right towards Thomaston. And what's interesting is that there was a veterans organization at the time made up of Civil War veterans called the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. And many of those members were not in favor of a monument to honor Dorrance Atwater because they thought that he was trying to make a profit of selling the death rolls back to the government. But they lost out, and the monument still stands. He died in 1907, and he's buried in San Francisco. Now the following I found written by John Simkin and published on the website SpartacusEducational.com. Some of this man I knew a little bit. My grandfather referenced him from time to time. My grandfather had come to, I don't know if he knew him, but knew of him and probably ran into him. His name was Evans Carlson, the son of a church minister, was born in the United States in 1896. He ran away from home at the age of 14, and 2 years later lied about his age in order to join the United States Army, 14 years old. Carlson was sent to the Western Front in France during the First World War, but arrived too late to take part in the fighting. He left the Army after the war and worked as a salesman until 1922 when he joined the United States Marine Corps. 1927, Carlson was sent to China with the 4th Marines. After 3 years in China, he served in Nicaragua, where he had to deal with local bandit groups. This experience started a lifetime of interest in guerrilla warfare. After one successful operation against these bandits, Carlson was awarded the Navy Cross. After another tour of duty in China from 1933 to 1935, Carlson was appointed commander of the Marine Guard at the Presidential Home in Warm Springs. Carlson got to know Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and when he was sent to China again in 1937, he was asked to send weekly reports to the president. Carlson witnessed the Japanese capture of Shanghai before working as an observer with the Chinese army. Carlson noticed that while the Chinese conventional forces performed badly, the small Red Army was much more successful against the Japanese invaders. For the next 2 years, Carlson spent a considerable amount of time with the Red Army. He was impressed with the effectiveness of the guerrilla warfare tactics and by the way they developed good relationships with the local people. After finishing his period as an observer, Carlson upset his superiors by giving a newspaper interview where he praised the Red Army for forming cooperatives and accusing the U.S. government of helping Japan's war effort by supplying them with oil and other raw materials. When he was officially censored for the interview, he resigned from the United States Marine Corps. Carlson returned to the United States, where he wrote 2 books on the subject, The Chinese Army and The Twin Stars of China. He also joined the committee established by Henry J. Stimson to campaign for an embargo against Japan. In 1940, Carlson made a private visit to China in order to investigate the progress of the cooperative set up by the Red Army. While there, he became convinced that Japan would attack the United States. He visited General Douglas MacArthur and urged him to establish guerrilla unions in case the Japanese army invaded the Philippines. However, MacArthur ignored his advice. On his return to the United States, Carlson rejoined the U.S. Marines. After Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor, Carlson and Mayor Edson advocated the use of guerrilla warfare against the Japanese army in the Pacific War. Eventually, Edson was given command of the 1st Raider Battalion, whereas Carlson got the 2nd Raider Battalion. Over 7,000 applied to join the 2nd Raider Battalion, but only 1,000 were accepted. Each candidate was interviewed about the political significance of the war. He later said he favored men with initiative, adaptability, and held democratic views. James Roosevelt, the son of Franklin D. Roosevelt, became Carlson's assistant. Based in San Diego, the Carlson Raiders were taught the military tactics employed by the Red Army against the Japanese. This included learning how to kill silently and quickly, following the example of the guerrillas in China. Carlson abolished the traditional privileges enjoyed by officers. They ate the same food, wore the same clothes, and carried the same equipment. Carlson's observations of the Red Army convinced him that the men performed better when they believed in what they are fighting for a better political system. Therefore, Carlson provided information on the undemocratic nature of the governments in Nazi Germany and Japan. He also encouraged the men to discuss the kind of society the men wanted after the war. In August 1943, Carlson and 222 Marines set off from Pearl Harbor and they were landed on the small island of Macon Atoll. After 2 days of fighting, Carlson's men were able to destroy the radio station, burned equipment, and captured important documents. 30 Marines were killed before General Alexander Vandegrift ordered them to leave the island. As a result of the raid, the Japanese army forfeited the Gilbert Islands. On 4th November 1943, the Carlson's raiders landed in Guadalcanal. Over the next month, Carlson's men killed more than 500 Japanese, while only losing 17 men. Carlson himself was wounded and forced to return to the United States for treatment. Carlson's superiors told him that they were concerned about his unorthodox ideas and tactics. They were also concerned about his close friendship with Agnes Smedley, the radical journalist who was involved in campaigning for USA support of communist forces in China in order to help them fight the Japanese army in Asia. In May 1943, Carlson was promoted to be the executive officer of the Raider Regiment and was stripped of direct command of his battalion in Guadalcanal. Carlson now upset his superiors by becoming involved in a controversial project of publishing pamphlets on the contribution of the Afro-American in the war. Carlson eventually returned to action in November 1943 at the Battle of Tarawa. On Saipan, he received several wounds when trying to rescue a radio operator who had been shot by the Japanese. He never fully recovered from his injuries and was forced to retire from the United States Marines. Carlson's exploits were celebrated by the book The Big Yankee, The Life of Carlson of the Raiders, and the feature film Gung Ho. He eventually achieved the rank of general. After the war, Carlson ran for the Senate in California, but was forced to withdraw after suffering a heart attack. Evans Carlson died after another heart attack in May 1947 and was laid to rest in Arlington Cemetery. His mother and father are buried here in West Cemetery. Now, what does Evans Carlson have to do with Plymouth? Well, his father was the Reverend Thomas Alpine Carlson and was the Reverend of this very church from 1926 to 1944. And I noticed before I came up, there's a brass plaque on the front of this pulpit, and it's dedicated to Reverend Carlson. Evans spent plenty of time here in Plymouth between stints in the Marines and while convalescing. The 2 books that he wrote were penned from his bedroom in the parsonage, which sits to your right. His mother and father are buried here in West Cemetery. According to town historian Judy Grugier, Carlson thought his time spent overseas, learned that the units performed better when they were given conviction of their mission and to understand what they were fighting for. Each man was handpicked and personally interviewed by Carlson or Jimmy Roosevelt. The 9-man squad was changed to 10, 3 sets of 3 and a leader with heavy firepower. They were called fire teams. Training consisting of a 50-mile hike every day, constant training, the rifle always at their side, including Lieutenant Colonel Carlson. Each man learned to assemble his rifle and take it apart blindfolded. Evans also trained the unit to work together without fear or favor, envy or contempt. To this training, he added a phrase he learned in China, gung ho, which meant working together. And as a small kid, I recall playing with the G.I. Joe dolls, and I think they had a cartoon, and he was always saying gung ho. It was born right out of a connection here in our town. Interesting, a few years ago, the Marine Corps decided to form some Marine Special Operations units. I guess they were a little jealous that the Army's had Special Forces, the Green Berets, for years. And they call them Raider battalions based on on Carlson's ideas that worked pretty well during the World War II. Another fellow from Plymouth who had some great contributions in World War II was Staff Sergeant George Carl Janser. George was the son of John Stanley Janser and Stefana Rogaski. He was the second child to John and Stefana after his brother Edward. Like his older brother, George had spent his whole life in Connecticut, and again like his older brother, on 7th May 1942 in Hartford, enlisted with the Army as a private. Staff Sergeant Janser was the tail gunner on a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bomber named Shack Rabbit 3. George was one of a 10-man crew of the 339th Bombardment Squadron of the 96th Bombardment Group of the 8th Army Air Force, flying a B-17F model from their base at Snetterton Heath north of London, England. On the 20th of October 1943, the target was a bomb manufacturing plant near Aachen, Germany. On the way, they were attacked by enemy fighter aircraft over Belgium and had to break away from the B-17 formation and became separated from the rest of the bombers. Two of the crew, radio operator Frederick William McManus and tail gunner George Carl Janser, were killed during the attacks by the fighter aircraft. Fortunately, the pilot was able to fight to keep the bomber aloft long enough for the remainder of the crew to bail out, but an explosion separated the tail of the doomed bomber, and it crashed not far away from an enemy Luftwaffe airfield just 35 miles southwest of Brussels, Belgium. When the captured crew members returned to the States after war's end, they learned the fate of their fellow crew members. Two more of the crew, co-pilot Second Lieutenant Arthur Charles Pickett and left waist gunner Jerome Chester Nowarczyk, had made it out of the plane but died or were killed after landing. The remainder of the crew, including pilots Robert Zeno Grimes, navigator Second Lieutenant James McElray, bombardier Second Lieutenant Charles Vernon Carlson, top turret gunner Engineer Tech Sergeant Theodore Ralph Kellers, right waist gunner Staff Sergeant Harold Threadwell Sheets, and ball turner gunner Staff Sergeant Robert William Menton all had survived the war. Sergeant Janser's body was found in the tail section of the crashed aircraft and was buried at a communal cemetery near Ath, Belgium. After the war, Sergeant Janser was brought home and reinterred near his home in St. Mary's Cemetery. He was the first serviceman from Plymouth to die in World War II of Polish descent, and now the defunct Polish Legion of American Veterans Post 95 was named after him. It was the PLAV Post 95. It's now the home of Eliminatum Pest Control on Beach Avenue. I'm a little too old to remember ever having gone in there, but maybe some of the people in this room spent some time in there socializing and having a few drinks. This article was published on January 8th, 2001, and it's about a man that I knew. He was a member of my American Legion post. He was a great guy, wonderful laugh, and it's about Andre St. Laurent. As part of the U.S. Army's mobile force in Vietnam, Andre St. Laurent's detachment regularly fought enemy troops on their own terms. St. Laurent and 9 other U.S. soldiers were crouched in a South Vietnamese jungle on the morning of November 17, 1967, when they noticed a peculiar pruning job. He recalled how the Vietnamese had meticulously stripped leaves off of every branch from knee level down, providing sight lines for a Vietnamese machine gun nest. You could see from a foxhole, but standing up you couldn't see down, said St. Laurent, then 63 of the Terryville section of Plymouth, who received the military's Silver Star on Sunday, which is the 3rd highest award that the Army has for combat duties. 33 years after he took command, that November 17th, U.S. Representative Nancy Johnson, Republican, 6th District, awarded St. Laurent his commendation for gallantry in combat. We never dreamed it would be a base camp there, St. Laurent recalled during an afternoon reception at Johnson's district office on Myrtle Street. Unfortunately, we found them waiting for us. All 10 U.S. soldiers were hit by a barrage of machine gun fire that killed the front point man. St. Laurent took over as patrol leader for the group supervising sergeant, who was seriously wounded in the head. St. Laurent detonated explosives to give his soldiers a smokescreen to help their escape, guided U.S. aircraft to fire on the Vietnamese base camp, and dragged the dead soldier's body out. The shrapnel he received in the fighting remains in his knee, but obtaining the Silver Star took several tries, even though St. Laurent's first sergeant, Bernard W. Newman, recommended the medal soon after the battle, St. Laurent said. In my research, First Sergeant Bernard W. Newman received the Medal of Honor for actions later on. After 5 years on and off in Vietnam, from 1967 to 1972, St. Laurent bears multiple stripes and a chest full of decorations. These include 4 Purple Hearts, 3 Air Medals with a V for Valor, after he was shot down in his helicopter 3 times, 3 American Commendation Medals, Army Commendation Medals, and 3 Presidential Unit Citations. I kept going back because all of my friends were there, said the Canadian-born St. Laurent, who grew up in Waterbury. He joined the Marine Corps at 17 and switched to the Army at 26. I had to support them, and they did the same for me. When St. Laurent finally returned to the United States, he decided to lay low, feeling the unpopularity that service in Vietnam brought. After retiring from the Army in 1974, marrying and settling in central Connecticut, he finally attended his first Special Forces reunion about 10 years ago after persuasion by Newman. Newman learned from St. Laurent that his initial Silver Star recommendation had been downgraded to an Army Commendation Medal, which is quite a few steps below a Silver Star. Other attempts also failed due to military bureaucracy and lost paperwork, St. Laurent said. St. Laurent finally sought help from Johnson, his congresswoman, who on Sunday described the gratitude she hears while traveling in Asia as part of the House Ways and Means Committee. If you had not stopped communism, we'd have been communists now, Johnson said she heard frequently. I suppose I could have pinned it on you, the congresswoman later said, indicating the medal's navy-colored case and St. Laurent's chest full of colorful medals, but I wouldn't have the slightest idea where it'd go. Andre was a resident of Terryville and spent many years after his second retirement from Pratt & Whitney, or United Technologies, as a substitute teacher at Terryville High School. He served many years as American Legion Plymouth Post No. 20 service officer, and he passed away on April 8th, 2018 at the age of 80. I know that many times when he'd substitute at Terryville High School, he'd wear his full Army dress green uniform with his green beret and his jump boots, and it really brought a lot of favor to the students there. Now, jumping ahead a little bit, or more recent, we have another soldier here that paid the ultimate sacrifice. His name is Philip Robert Albert. He was born on 21st of August, 1962 in Southington, Harford County, Connecticut. But he grew up here in Terryville, and he was the youngest of 8 children. Philip joined the U.S. Army at the age of 18 and was thinking of retiring after 22 years of service to possibly start his own business in construction. He served in the Gulf War in 1991 and was on his second tour of duty in Afghanistan, taking part in Operation Mountain Resolve. He loved the service and was very proud of his work. Life as a soldier suited him. Philip's fellow soldiers remembered him as an infantryman's infantryman and a solid commander. On the 23rd of November 2003, Sergeant Major Albert was assigned to 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, 10th Mountain Division, Fort Drum, New York, which was deployed in Afghanistan. Albert was on board an MH-53 Pavlo helicopter conducting combat operations for Operation Mountain Resolve when it crashed 9 miles east of Bagram Air Base. A compressor problem caused one of the 2 engines on the Pavlo to stall, leaving it with 1 engine operating and too much weight to carry in the thin mountain air. The pilots unsuccessfully attempted to jettison the auxiliary tanks. Then the other engine stalled while they attempted an emergency landing. With all power lost, the helicopter fell from an altitude of about 200 feet onto an uneven riverbank where it rolled over and burst into flames. Somehow 8 people managed to survive. Although injured himself, Albert made several trips back and forth from the burning helicopter to carry other soldiers to safety. He was killed when the helicopter's fuel tank exploded as he tried to extricate a soldier who was tangled in the wreckage. He was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for his life-saving actions. I did some research and I found some military bulletin boards where actually one of the people that he saved had wrote a little memorial to him. So it's It's a little humbling when you can read someone's firsthand account of being saved by a guy that gave his life to help others, and it was from this little town. His medals, awards, and badges include the Bronze Star Medal with Bronze Oak Leaf Cluster, the Purple Heart, Meritorious Service Medal, Army Commendation Medal, Army Achievement Medal, Army Good Conduct Medal, National Defense Service Medal, Afghanistan Campaign Medal with Bronze Star, Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, Army NCO Professional Development Ribbon, Army Service Ribbon, Army Overseas Service Ribbon, Combat Infantryman Badge, Expert Infantryman Badge, and Parachuter's Badge. Phillips' remains are buried in 2 locations, which is common when the cause of death has been a devastating plane or helicopter crash. The first funeral and burial was held for his family at St. Joseph's Cemetery in Bristol on 9 December 2003. The second burial, with full military honors, took place on 21 January 2004 at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia. The grave is located in Section 60, Site 1821. An honor guard preceded a horse-drawn caisson containing a single flag-draped coffin with the remains of the 5 servicemen killed in the crash. Because their remains were commingled, the 5 men were buried in a single coffin with a single headstone. The names of the 5 men, in the order they are listed on the headstone, are Sergeant Major Philip R. Albert, U.S. Army; Master Sergeant William J. Kerwood, U.S. Air Force; Staff Sergeant Thomas A. Walkup, Jr., U.S. Air Force; Technical Sergeant Howard A. Walters, U.S. Air Force; Major Stephen Plymouth, U.S. Air Force. Here before I end, give a little talk about someone here that I grew up with. It was Greg Fortier. He's still alive. I don't know how, because I remember at nursery at the Terryville Congregational Church's nursery school there, they had this little indoor playscape thing, and I distinctly remember stepping on his head. I was about 3 or 4 years old. And I wasn't quite as heavy then as I am now, but he managed to do okay for himself. Colonel Gregory S. Fortier is a native of Terryville, Connecticut, and a graduate of Terryville High School class of 1992, which I believe he finished first in his class. He was commissioned in the regular Army upon graduation from the United States Military Academy at West Point in June 1996, once again first in his class. He was inducted in the aviation branch upon completion of initial entry rotary wing training in the Aviation Officers Basic Course, and was assessed to the Army Acquisition Corps in 2005. Colonel Fortier holds a Bachelor's of Science in Operations Research from the U.S. Military Academy, a Master's of Science in Industrial Engineering from the University of Central Florida, and a Master's of Science in the National Resource Strategy from the Eisenhower School. He was a member of the Pi Mu Epsilon 1996 and Phi Kappa Phi 2006 Honor Societies. He is a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt certified and was awarded the 2012 Department of the Army Lean Six Sigma Excellence Award for his work in finding efficiencies in aviary training within developmental flight test squadrons. Colonel Fortier began his career as the Army's last active duty Aero Scout platoon leader, OH-58A-1. Those were the small little aircraft that would accompany the Apache gunships and do the scouting for them. They had this big infrared ball that sat on top so they could look down the battlefield and relay information to the Apache gunships. They've now done away with most of that program. He subsequently served as platoon leader and later assistant operations officer, 3rd Squadron, 4th Cavalry Regiment, Wheeler Army Airfield, adjutant, task force executive officer, and later commander B Troop, 1st Squadron, 17th Cavalry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Colonel Fortier's research, development, test, evaluation, acquisition experience includes assistant product manager for unmanned interoperability in Army rotorcraft and chief of flight test, Aviation Applied Technology Directorate, Fort Eustis, Virginia, commander. Aviation Flight Test Directorate, Redstone Test Center, Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. Executive Officer and Commander, United States Naval Test Pilot School, which I was told that he was the very first Army officer to command a Navy test pilot school. Naval Air Station, Poxitonic River, Maryland, and Executive Officer to the Principal Deputy to the Assistant Secretary of the Army. He is now stationed at Fort Rucker, Alabama, where he is in charge of, I forgot what he's in charge of, but he's been deployed to Iraq, and he falls in line with those that gave towards the military effort from the town of Plymouth, and we're quite proud of him. Well, that concludes my talk. Does anybody have any questions that maybe I can answer? I know when I go down to the Veterans Memorial on Baldwin Park and I read the names there, not only those that died, but those that served and lived, I know most of those names, maybe not personally, but I've known them through my parents and grandparents and know the names. And it's good knowing that we live in a small town where we can recognize a lot of people. And I'm thankful for all the accomplishments that those that served that gave for us. So that concludes my talk. Anybody have anything they'd like to share about Marie? My service in the military? I enlisted in 1992 when I lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. I went in the Army as a medical equipment repairer. It's a job that I still do today. They trained me for 38 weeks, although I got held back one module, so I was there about a month longer than I should have, which gave me some great experience. But they trained us on how to troubleshoot, repair medical devices, medical equipment, all electronics down to the component level. They taught us all about mechanical stuff, x-ray and everything. So I left, that was at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center, Aurora. And when I went there after basic training, there was no drill sergeants there. It was kind of like being in college. We were left to our own devices. And the Army decided that wasn't such a great idea, because after several months they started getting drill sergeants there, but they didn't have any effect on me. They were for the newer classes that were coming in. After that, I got assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and when they showed the original, it was a big laser disc. This was in 1991, I think, when I signed the oath. And they didn't even have the small compact disc. It looked like a record, but it was a laser disc. And they showed what the job was like. And they showed the guys wearing all hospital white uniforms working in an operating room with these pretty nurses surrounded by a doctor. I said, well, hey, this can't be bad. Little did I know, I found out when I got to Fort Bragg, I'd never see the inside of a hospital until I had to take an ambulance ride in there. And I spent my time in field units. And I was first assigned to a medical logistics battalion, which they've now reconfigured and it no longer exists. But we had medical equipment repair, medical supply warehouse, and a laboratory that was all of the blood banks. So we were prepared to deploy along with the 82nd Airborne, and we also supported the entire 18th Airborne Division, with 18th Airborne Corps, which comprised of the 101st Airborne Division, 82nd Airborne Division, 10th Mountain Division, and the 24th Infantry Division. And we were also in charge of pretty much supporting anybody east of the Mississippi River as far as reserve units and National Guard and any other Army field capabilities. I went to jump school in May of 1994, earned my airborne wings at Fort Benning, North Carolina, and ended up deployed to Haiti in September of 1994, which was supposed to be an invasion. We were supposed to conduct a combat parachute jump into Port-au-Prince to overthrow the government. Colin Powell, Jimmy Carter went down there and they talked them out of it. But the real truth was that at the disembarkment point for all of the Army Airborne at Fort Bragg's nearby Pope Army Airfield, was Pope Air Force Base at the time, there was a payphone booth. And it seems that there was a phone call that had been recorded and was placed from the payphone booth to the presidential palace in Haiti. So it seems that they had a spy within our ranks, but a phone call was made and said the 82nd Airborne Division is now on their way. They just left. And with that, the Haitian government decided to leave and went into exile. So what was supposed to be a combat parachute jump for most of us turned into going in the next day on aircraft and landing at the airfield. And I spent a month there. I returned home back to Fort Bragg and spent a lot of time out in the field, learning things, traveling around. And I was fortunate to go back to Haiti 2 years later for the summer of 1996 in a limited role where we had established, it was called Operation Fairwinds, and we ran a small hospital, a small little post, and we provided all the medical aid and security for National Guard and Army Reserve units that would cycle through, mostly engineer battalions that were responsible for digging wells and building schools and other structures in Haiti for the government there. I got to see some behind the scenes looks at a company called, it's a government agency called USAID, United States Aid for International Development. If you do some research there, I think they're more closely related with the CIA than they are with anything else. Well, that was pretty interesting. I spent the summer there. It was very nice. I got to go out on the weekends and got my scuba diving certification. So it was pretty rough duty. Got sunburned a lot. And then I ended up in Bosnia from 1997 to 1998 as part of the Stabilization Force 2, and worked there at a hospital called, I can't remember the place. We called it the Blue Factory because we lived in converted shipping containers. They were all painted blue, and they were stacked up on each other. So it was kind of like almost the same shape but reversed of the Plymouth Motor Lodge, but it was a lot cleaner. And no drug use and no police had to come. And we were co-located with the Norwegians, and they had a little shack, a nightclub, and they were allowed to have alcohol, and we weren't. But we got to go in there sometimes and hang out with them, have some soda. And they also had an above-ground swimming pool, so we didn't get to use it because it was too cold when we were there, but it was real tough duty. So I could say that my Army experience was very good. I didn't have nearly the experiences that many of our recent veterans had to go through in war, but I learned a lot. I learned that it's probably not the best idea to jump out of airplanes because I've got some service injuries from that, but it was a lot of fun and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed my time, and I got out. Got out in 1999 and was able to transition right into the civilian workforce, doing almost the same thing I did in the Army, but this time I got to work inside of a hospital where it was a lot cleaner. And I left Fort Bragg on a Friday and arrived in Vermont on that next Monday and started work right away. So I was one of the lucky ones that was able to choose a specialty and occupation that translated into the civilian world and segued right from there. And I'm still doing the same thing now. And it's been 21 years now since I've been out. So, anybody want to have any experiences of their own they'd like to share? Well, with that, I'll conclude my presentation. It's 5 minutes to 8, so I'll get you out of here a little early. And thank you very much.